Hello. So this is the first video for Unit 3 on cell metabolism. We are going to focus on two main metabolic pathways, photosynthesis and respiration. Now, any discussion of metabolism cannot be complete without differentiating between the two main groups, the anabolic reactions and the catabolic reactions. Because remember, when we discuss the overall metabolism of an organism or of a cell, it's the sum of all chemical reactions taking place in that individual cell or in that organism with the intention of maintaining homeostasis or internal balance. Now, some of those reactions are anabolic, right? Anabolic reactions are reactions that involve smaller molecules being formed into larger molecules. And anabolic reactions generally require an input of energy. So for example, if we have a bunch of monosaccharides right here and we want to form a large polysaccharide, that is going to be an anabolic reaction. And for monosaccharides to be linked together, we're going to use dehydration synthesis. Now, some other reactions, such as photosynthesis and protein synthesis, right? Anytime you hear that term synthesis, we're going to make something, so it's probably going to be anabolic. A lot of these reactions, these anabolic reactions that synthesize larger molecules, such as proteins or the carbohydrates produced in photosynthesis, are going to be endergonic reactions. Endergonic reactions simply mean that energy is stored and that the overall energy present in the products would be higher than that of the reactants. And we'll talk more about that later. So we're talking about an investment or some form of storing energy. And then catabolic reactions over here are going to involve a larger molecule being broken down, right? Usually this is hydrolysis if we're talking about our biomolecules. And as these larger molecules are hydrolyzed or broken down into their smaller constituents or smaller building blocks, maybe this is a large protein, or maybe it's a triglyceride molecule that we're catabolizing. We're going to hydrolyze it and we're going to produce the smaller building blocks. If we're talking about proteins, these would be amino acids. If we were talking about lipids, these would be fatty acids or glycerol molecules. And it usually involves the release of energy, right? So anabolic, we're going to store energy. Catabolic, we're usually releasing it. And so catabolic reactions, if energy is released, are known as exergonic, right? And so energy exits in exergonic reactions. So usually, the energy in the reactants, or what we're starting with, would be higher than what's available in the products. And a good example of a catabolic reaction that would be exergonic would be cellular respiration, which is what we're going to talk about. Now, all living things need some form of energy. And the energy that is required by cells to perform these anabolic reactions would be ATP. Now remember, ATP is one of our nucleic acids that we discussed in the prior unit. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. And if you remember from our discussion, the energy is contained in those phosphate bonds. Now, all of these organisms in this food chain are comprised or composed of many cells. These are all multicellular eukaryotic organisms, right? And so the grass down here produces the energy or the sugars available to the next trophic level. And each of these organisms needs ATP to maintain homeostasis, right? Each of these organisms is going to require a constant supply of either carbohydrate or lipid so that they can maintain the appropriate amount of ATP in their cells. So we'll talk a lot about how those carbohydrates and lipids actually become usable forms of energy for our cells, and that would be ATP. So how do we get from glucose to ATP? Now, one thing to take note of is that this transfer of energy through an ecosystem, right, and even through from one cell to the next, is not a perfect system, right? And so energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Well, technically it could, but that's a discussion for another physics class. But for what we need, we'll just pretend that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It simply gets transferred from one form to the next. So here we start with solar energy, right? radiant energy from the sun. And we know that from our elementary school and middle school science classes that the energy from the sun can be converted to sugars, right? And so we're taking radiant or radiation, solar energy, and converting it into chemical energy. And then that chemical energy can be converted from one form to the next. And then eventually it might be converted into mechanical energy or the energy of movement. Now, if you notice through this whole process, we're constantly losing energy to the environment as heat, right? And that's actually the second law of thermodynamics, right? As energy is transferred from one form to the next, there's a constant loss of energy, usually as heat to the environment. Now, when discussing this flow or transfer of energy from one organism to the next, we need to familiarize ourselves with some classic terms, right? And so the plant or the tree in this diagram would be referred to as a producer. Now, we're going to kind of take it up a notch and be a little bit more specific. And we would refer to this producer or tree as an autotroph. Auto meaning self, kind of like autopilot, plane flying itself, and troph referring to energy. So this is an organism that can satisfy its own energy needs. It can produce its own energy. And in this case of the plant, it's making carbohydrates with photosynthesis. So if we wanted to be really technical, we would call this tree a photoautotroph because it feeds itself with light, right? And it makes carbohydrates. Now, there are other organisms out there that are able to produce carbohydrates and other forms of usable energy without sunlight. And a lot of those are chemoautotrophs, right? So they're using inorganic compounds as their source of energy to form carbohydrates. And then we've got our heterotrophs, right? Hetero meaning different. So these are organisms that have they need a different source of energy, and we call them consumers, right? So a moose or animal, the animals in this diagram right here, they're consumers. They're heterotrophic. So they are incapable of forming or synthesizing novel carbohydrates. They can't take energy from their environments and, convert it into a chemical form. They need to consume it, right? And so these animals are eating these plants and they're consuming the carbohydrates that were initially synthesized by these autotrophs. And we know that, because of our discussion earlier, that as the heterotroph consumes the autotroph, some of that energy is lost as heat, right? Because it takes energy to chew and to digest, and there's going to be a constant loss of heat there. And there are some organisms out there that are mixotrophic, right? And they can perform, autotrophic and heterotrophic functions, and they're real oddballs, and we'll talk about them later on. Now, there are lots of different chemical reactions out there, right, that drive this transfer of energy from one compound to the next, or in the case of photosynthesis, from solar radiation into chemical energy, right? And so we need to talk about how best to communicate these chemical reactions. Generally speaking, what we start with, right, the molecules and compounds we start with, we call those reactants. And then what we end up producing, we refer to those as products. And you can see the arrow kind of shows or represents the direction in which this chemical reaction is proceeding. Eventually, when you take chemistry, you'll also notice there might be double arrows pointing in both directions where it kind of bounces back and forth. But a lot of the chemical reactions we are going to focus on are one directional, right? So we're going to start with some reactants. Chemical reaction will happen. We'll have products. And in those particular systems, the chemical reaction is not going to be reversible per se. Now, you don't really need to know this for this class, but these are some different examples of chemical reactions. We have a synthesis reaction right here. We've got two molecules that are being brought together to form a larger one. Here we have a decomposition reaction, right, where something larger is breaking down. And then here we have a single replacement. They're kind of switching dance partners. And if this is single replacement, what do you think this kind of chemical reaction is called? That's right, it's a double replacement. But we don't need to worry about those vocabulary terms, just a preview of things to come for when you decide to take chemistry. Now, the two chemical reactions we're going to focus a lot on in this unit are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And so you can see over here, we've got our reactants, right? The things on the left-hand side of the arrow, what we're starting with. And then over here, we have our products, right? And you can see that, diagrams will be different and you need to be flexible. You can see there's two arrows here. You can put one arrow there. It doesn't matter. And you can see that light energy is coming in through the from the outside, from the environment over here. And you notice that in a lot of chemical reactions in the chemical formulas, you won't see light included in this equation. And that's because light is not a chemical, right? Light energy is a form of electromagnetic radiation. So a lot of times when we talk about light energy in terms of photosynthesis, we'll use the term photon, right? Which would be kind of like an individual packet of light. It's kind of weird. Light is neither a particle nor a wave. It's kind of a mixture of both. So we just simply use the term photon. And then cellular respiration, we've got our reactants over here. Our arrows pointing towards our products, and you can see that we're producing some energy in the form of ATP. Well, that's all I have for this video. The next video will pick up with a more detailed description of photosynthesis.